Since there's a high correlation between people who attend academic conferences and listeners to National Public Radio, I suspect that many of you will be familiar with a project NPR sponsored a few years ago called This I Believe. The project recalled and revived a practice that began in the 1950s when Edward R. Murrow hosted a radio show of the same name. On that show, people from all walks of life read brief essays encapsulating their core values, or as some would call them, their philosophies of life. Some of these old essays by writers, scientists, politicians, athletes were aired again, and new essays were commissioned and broadcast. Further, listeners were invited to write their own essays and submit them, perhaps to be selected for radio themselves or otherwise shared in an archive accessible through the internet. I remember the first time I heard of the project thinking what a nice idea it was. I particularly liked the open invitation to everyone to compose and submit a This I Believe essay. Driving along, since when I listen to NPR it's always because I'm driving along, I found myself wondering what I would focus on if I were to write such an essay. To my shame and dismay, I came up blank. Apparently, I didn't have a philosophy of life. Over time, I got over my disappointment with myself and came to accept the fact that I was just not a This I Believe kind of person. Much as I admire people who can articulate their core commitments and who shape their lives around them, and interesting as I found many of the This I Believe essays I heard, I've come to terms with the fact that I have a more reactive and a more critical personality. When someone offers me words of wisdom, sound bites that are meant to encapsulate universal but not universally recognized truths, I tend to respond to them, not by adopting the offered principles as my own, nor by coming up with alternate principles, but by questioning them and usually deciding that they are overly simple, failing to take into account a host of exceptions and qualifications that flood my mind. But then, in 2009, I received an invitation from the Phi Beta Kappa Society to serve as that year's Romanelle professor, an honor that carried with it the expectation that I would present 3 public lectures unified by a single theme. To come up with a topic, I needed to search hard for a subject that I felt was both important enough to warrant 3 lectures, and about which I felt I had enough to say to warrant people listening to me discussing it. As I reviewed the half-developed ideas for essays in my mind and the half-finished manuscripts on my shelf, it dawned on me that I did, after all, have at least one belief of the sort This I Believe essays are based on. Namely, the belief that, trite though it is, love really does make the world go round. That is, to put it both more cautiously and less metaphorically, of all the candidates I could think of for the single most important thing in life, love seemed to me by far the most plausible candidate. Of course, this is hardly news. Sayings like love makes the world go round don't become trite for nothing. Most of us learned about the importance of love at our mother's or father's knee, and the sentiment is reinforced in church, in school, in songs and movies, fairy tales and legends. Still, if one looks at the history of Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy too, judging from the little I know of it, it's remarkable how infrequently this sentiment is reflected. Over its history, philosophy has given love surprisingly little attention. The most dominant philosophical theories about what is important in life don't mention love at the fundamental level. To the extent that these theories assign love a place in their schemes, their accounts of love's value are too contingent and instrumental to jibe with the sentiment that I and so many others have. Hedonism, for example, identifies the fundamental source of value with pleasure and the absence of pain. According to hedonism, the more pleasure and less pain an individual life contains, the better it is. To the hedonist, then, the questions of whether and why love might be important and valuable depend for their answers on how love contributes to or detracts from the more ultimate aim of maximizing pleasure. Since love is in fact the source of a vast array of pleasures, hedonism has no difficulty giving love a very important and positive weight. Still, according to this view, love's value is conditional. If a person or a world could be just as happy without love as with it, then love would serve no function and its value would be nil. Further, love famously does not always add to our pleasure. It sometimes detracts from it. Not only when love is unrequited, but when one's loved ones get sick or get fired, when they must be far away from us, and of course, when they die. According to hedonism, when love increases pain, its value is worse than nothing. We would be better off without it. But that is precisely the opposite of the sentiment I think I believe in a this I believe kind of way, and that I would like to better understand. In contrast to hedonism stands another tradition associated with the Stoics and with Kant that identifies the best life not with pleasure but with virtue. According to this line of thought, if you live virtuously, in a way you can look back on with pride, then nothing can hurt you. On this view, love's importance comes from the way in which it opens up opportunities for virtue. Since love really does generate opportunities for virtue, this theory, too, has no trouble crediting love with an important role in our lives. For example, love typically puts you in closer and more intimate contact with other people than you would otherwise be in. It allows you to know better when certain people are in trouble and what they might need. And it may make it possible for them to receive comfort from you that they could not accept or enjoy from a stranger or an acquaintance. Moreover, a virtue theorist might point out that in accepting love, one gives others an opportunity for virtue. And so there is a kind of virtue made possible not only in loving, but in being loved. Interestingly, the very aspects of love that a hedonist has a hard time making sense of as valuable, aspects that are called up when one's beloved is suffering and in need, are those that the virtue theorist can most easily recognize as good. Nonetheless, the account this theory provides of the value of love is no better than the hedonists. After all, even if love creates some opportunities for virtue that you wouldn't otherwise have, there are plenty of opportunities available without it. You don't have to love an undernourished family in order to feed them. You don't have to love a wounded child in order to donate blood for her. You don't have to love a stranded motorist in order to help change his tire. Furthermore, just as love famously can be a source of pain as well as of pleasure, it can be a motive for vice as well as virtue. If love expands your opportunities to act well for the sake of your loved ones, it also tempts you to act badly in neglecting or even harming people whose needs or interests put them in competition with those you love. According to those who identify goodness with virtue, then, as well as those who identify goodness with pleasure, love's importance is too contingent and conditional to satisfyingly explain the distinctive importance I and others take it to have. What then, if anything, is so great about love? What makes love so special? This is the question I chose to investigate in the first of my Romanelle lectures, and the one that I want to explore today. One might think that before proceeding to address this question, we ought to be clearer about what love is. The word love is used in myriad ways to characterize relationships of an enormous variety, with friends, family, pets, one's country. We talk sometimes of loving an activity, such as philosophy or basketball. I live in North Carolina, where we talk about loving basketball quite a lot. We are asked to love our enemies, our neighbors, or more generally, our fellow human beings. Do we mean the same thing by love in all these instances? Is there anything they all have in common? Insofar as we entertain such thoughts as love makes the world go round, do we have one kind of relationship in particular in mind? There was a period when philosophy, at least in the English-speaking world, conceived its mission as that of providing conceptual analyses of fundamental terms. Philosophers tried to pin down precisely the meaning of such basic concepts as knowledge, language, science, art. They discussed and refuted, revised and debated proposals for necessary and sufficient conditions of all these terms. But due in part to the influence of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, philosophers have largely moved on. As Wittgenstein noted, many concepts are not so sharply bounded as that model of definition seemed to presume. Rather, what holds a group of objects or activities together, making it appropriate to categorize them all under a single term, may be a set of overlapping similarities on the model of family resemblances. In that spirit, I take it that the inquiry into what love is that is important for our enterprise need not be a quest for an explicit definition, but rather an exploration of the word's many uses with an interest in seeing what, if anything, they all have in common, and what common strands link many of them together beyond that. Nor does it seem particularly fruitful to keep this inquiry separate from and prior to an explanation of the question that motivates it, the question of love's importance. Rather than proceed by first asking what love is, and only after answering it, moving on to ask why love is special, it seems best to treat these questions as equal partners to be explored together. The questions I want to investigate, then, might best be expressed as follows. What can love be such that it is plausible to think of it as being a universal or near universal ingredient of a good life? And in virtue of what is love so understood, so important? What can love be such that it is plausible to think of it as a deeply important feature of almost any good life? What can we mean by love when we so much as entertain the thought that it makes the world go round? I've said that it can be used to refer to myriad relationships. In fact, the term is used more broadly still, sometimes in a way that doesn't explicitly invoke relationships at all. Thus, it is sometimes said that God is love, though this has always struck me as mysterious. And hearts and people are sometimes described as full of love, even when they have no one to give it to or to share it with. This use seems especially common in country music. There's also a superficial use of love, as in, I love what you've done with your hair. But I shall set these uses aside. They are not what I, nor I think what anyone has in mind when they ponder love's importance in a life well lived. Rather, I shall simply assume that when people talk or write about love's importance, what they have in mind first and foremost are loving relationships, and typically loving relationships with other human beings. Even within this narrowed range, however, the kinds of relationships that uncontroversially count as loving ones vary tremendously. Thus, some people, when they talk abstractly about love, are thinking especially of romantic love, or perhaps of a kind of love that can be exemplified either by romantic love or close friendship. Others take family relations, especially the relation between parent and child, as their paradigm. Clearly, some of the things it makes sense to say of one kind of love relationship would be implausible and inappropriate when applied to another. It's a salient fact about loves of romance and of friendship that in some sense they are chosen. Something about the other person attracts you, and, if the love is reciprocal, something about you attracts them. Much of what is wonderful about such love is connected to this feature. Falling in love tends to involve finding the person delightful, as well as admiring them, seeing them as good. And so the chance to be with them, even time spent thinking about them, is a source of intense pleasure. A further, often equally intense pleasure comes from the perception that the person you love loves you back. He chose me can be, among other things, an incredibly strong compliment and an enormous boost to one's self-esteem. Love among family members is not typically like that. While it would be crazy for romantic love or love of a close friend not to be based on qualities of the loved ones to which the lover responds, it is chilling to imagine a parent whose attitude to her child waits upon finding out what the child is like, and pretty unpalatable to think of siblings relating to each other in this way too. Parents of wanted children tend to stand ready to love them no matter what they are like. The thought that love is or should be unconditional comes most quickly to mind when thinking about relationships like this. In important ways, these different kinds of loving relationships play different roles in our lives. They serve different functions and address different needs. Insofar as one finds it plausible to think of love as an especially important and nearly universal value, is it one of these types of relationships rather than the other that one has in mind? Or is there something these types of relationships have in common, in virtue of which they are all instances of love? And if so, can this plausibly be the feature that makes love of any such kind distinctly valuable? I'm attracted to the second answer for at least two reasons. One is that it just seems false to me that a life without children or a life without romance is bound to be a less complete and successful life than one with such relationships. Even though children may be rewardingly at the center of life for many people, it doesn't take that much observation or imagination to see that a life can also be immensely successful and gratifying without them. The same goes for a life without a romantic partner. Second, although the character of loving relationships between lovers and friends may well be markedly different from relationships between siblings or between parents and children in their early stages, they tend to grow more similar to each other over time, suggesting that they do have something valuable in common worth trying to articulate. Thus, although a new parent stands ready to love her child no matter what the child will turn out to be like, as the child develops and reveals her personality, the parent comes to be proud and appreciative of her, loving qualities in the child as well as the child herself. And the longer the relationship with a friend or romantic partner goes on, the freer one's attachment tends to become from the characteristics that originally brought the lovers or friends together. It is frequently said that you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. But, as one of my friends pointed out to me, it's not really true. You can't choose your friends either. At least much of the time, once you've got your friends, you've got them for life. Even if, were you meeting them now, you might not like them as much or have as much in common with them as you do with others in your community who do not happen to be your friends. In some ways, then, love of friends and family are importantly alike, and I would suggest importantly alike in value. Many of us have close friends and close family. Both types of relationships play large and sometimes competing roles in our lives. But other people's lives are more exclusively centered on family or on non-familial friends, and I see no reason to think that one sort of life is, in general, more rewarding or meaningful than another. The contrast between a life without love and a life with it seems different. A life without love seems sad, empty, missing an important, possibly essential ingredient for a good life, no matter what else it contains. It has a void that can only be filled by love, but what kind of love may not matter. But what is it about love, common to relationships of friendship, romance, and family, that make it so irreplaceable in a life well lived? To repeat the linked and basic questions we are exploring, what is love such that it is plausibly taken to be a universal ingredient of a good life, and in virtue of what is love so important? In a brilliant and provocative article, the philosopher David Velleman surveys what analytic philosophers have had to say about love, concluding that they, like Freud, tend to conceive of love as having a characteristic aim or aims. Of the many philosophers he quotes, Henry Sidgwick's description is paradigmatic. After noting that love always involves a desire to do good to the object beloved, he adds that it includes, beside the benevolent impulse, a desire of the society of the beloved. A similar view is echoed by Lawrence Thomas, who writes, "Love is feeling anchored in an intense and non-fleeting desire to engage in mutual caring, sharing, and physical expression with the individual in question." William Lyons uses abstract variables to say the same thing. For X to love Y, X must not merely evaluate Y as appealing, but X must want certain things in regard to Y as well. X must want to be with Y, to please Y, to cherish Y, to want Y to return the love, to want Y to think well of him. John Rawls, somewhat more cautiously, writes, love clearly has among its main elements the desire to advance the other person's good as this person's rational self-love would require. If these philosophers are right in thinking that love is or essentially includes desires to be with and to benefit the objects of one's love, the answer to the question, what is so important about love, may be connected to the desires that are so closely associated with it. Specifically, a proposal that suggests itself on this assumption is that love's function is that it gives one something to do. Since loving someone supplies one with wishes and goals, to be with the beloved and to enhance his or her life, it gives an otherwise aimless person direction and purpose. Velleman's response to this litany of characterizations of love, however, is eye-opening. In my opinion, he writes, the foregoing quotations express a sentimental fantasy. In this fantasy, love necessarily entails a desire to care and share and to benefit and be with. But surely, Velleman goes on, it's easy enough to love someone whom one cannot stand to be with. Just think of a troublemaking relation. The meddlesome aunt, cranky grandfather, smothering parent, or over-competitive sibling is dearly loved, one just has no desire for his or her company. The same ambivalence can occur in the most intimate relationships. When divorcing couples tell their children that they still love one another but cannot live together, they are telling not a white lie but a dark truth. In the presence of such everyday examples, the notion that loving someone entails wanting to be with him seems fantastic indeed. There is only slightly more realism, Velleman continues, in the suggestion that loving someone entails being moved to do him good. In this case, the authors quoted above seem to be thinking of a blissful family in which caring about others necessarily coincides with caring for them or taking care of them. Yet when I meaning Velleman, think of many of the people I love, parents, brothers, friends, I do not think of myself as an agent of their interests. I would of course do them a favor if asked, but in the absence of some occasion for benefiting them, I have no continuing or recurring desire to do so. At the thought of a close friend, my heart doesn't fill with an urge to do something for him, though it may indeed fill with love. Indeed, Velleman goes on to suggest that in most contexts, a love that is inseparable from the urge to benefit is an unhealthy love, bristling with uncalled-for impingements. Love becomes equally unhealthy if too closely allied with some of the other desires mentioned in these passages, the desire to please or to be well thought of, and so on. Of course, there are occasions for pleasing and impressing the people one loves, just as there are occasions for caring and sharing. But someone whose love was a bundle of these urges, to care and share and please and impress, such a lover would be an interfering, ingratiating nightmare. That was all Velleman. Velleman may be going too far, but his remarks are a useful antidote to our tendency to identify love with its most rewarding instances, and even more to the point, with its most active expressions. By focusing too much on certain paradigms, we forget the equal validity of other cases. In any event, I find Velleman's claim that love ought not to be conceived as a bundle of desires persuasive. For a person whose children are grown and self-sufficient, if any such there are, whose parents are cared for, whose friends live far away, there may be nothing to do or even sensibly to want to do to benefit his loved ones. Still, he has loved ones, and that he has them enhances his life in an important way, even if, under the circumstances, the loving relationships operate mainly in the background. But in what way? Unfortunately, Velleman's positive characterization of love seems to me as skewed and as unsatisfactory as the view he criticizes. Having found reason to question the assumption that love is essentially a pro-attitude toward a result, he suggests that love is an attitude toward the beloved himself but not toward any result at all. Rather, he suggests, love is an arresting awareness of a person's value, an appreciation, as it were, of a person's rational nature that somehow arrests our tendencies toward emotional self-protection, disarming our emotional defenses and making us vulnerable to the other. Velleman defends his view of love in part on phenomenological grounds. Comparing his view to the one he's criticized, he writes, "Love does not feel, to me at least, like an urge or impulse or inclination toward anything. It feels rather like a state of attentive suspension, similar to wonder or amazement or awe." Reading this, one wonders whether Velleman has forgotten about his meddlesome aunt and his overcompetitive brother. And does he really feel amazement and awe for his children when he's stuck on the New Jersey Turnpike in Thanksgiving traffic and they're fighting with each other in the back seat? Just as Velleman's opponents focus too much on the circumstances in which love for another allows or even calls for active participation in the other's life, Velleman concentrates too narrowly on cases at the other end of the spectrum, when circumstances allow one to simply stop and contemplate one's beloved. Moreover, and even despite warning against it, Velleman, like his adversaries, seems to be thinking only of love of people one also enjoys or admires, leaving aside the challenge of accommodating those relationships which, even though they are loving, are also, temporarily or permanently, annoying, frustrating, and difficult. It is not surprising that when one takes seriously the search for a feature or features all loving relationships share, keeping in mind the variety that ranges not only from sweethearts to siblings, but also from soulmates to meddlesome aunts, one will not find much. Indeed, I find only one such feature that may seem almost too obvious to mention. Specifically, loving someone always involves caring about the other person for his own sake. That is, when one loves someone, one wants his good, one wants him to flourish, if flourishing is an option. Moreover, one wants this, at least in part, unselfishly, that is, for the beloved's own sake, and independently of whether his flourishing or his continued existence contributes to one's own. This is not to say that love is necessarily or even typically disinterested. Though love always involves caring about the other for her own sake, it frequently also includes a desire for a certain kind of relationship with the beloved, and if that relationship is denied, a lover is spurned, a friend is betrayed, the love might not inappropriately be withdrawn. Nor do I mean to offer this feature as a complete definition of love. Though it seems to me love always involves caring about the loved one for her own sake, one might care about someone for her own sake in a way that we wouldn't want to identify with love. Certainly, a general attitude of goodwill to all men, or to all people, or to all of sentient creation falls short of what I mean by love. Such an attitude may be too casual or too slight to really count as a form of caring at all. But even a robust and disinterested concern for humanity may be motivated by duty or some other sense of what is called for that seems intuitively different from love. When you love someone, your attachment is not only deep, it is personal in a way that other forms of caring about something or someone for its own sake are not. Who and what I love says something about me that distinguishes me from other people. In loving someone or something, I declare a commitment to it that is different from the commitment I have and expect others to have of impersonal values. Most of us, of course, love only a relatively few people, and in loving them rather than others, we reflect and reveal something about who we particularly are. Indeed, it is sometimes said that who and what we love defines us. Our loves are closely bound up with and partly constitutive of our identities. It seems to me that something of this personal character exists even in the case of love that is less selective. A person who genuinely loves all of humanity, for example, has an attachment and concern for others that is different from that of even the most conscientiously benevolent people who are motivated by moral principles. There may be no more to be said at so general a level about the wide range of relationships that we call love than that love involves caring deeply and personally about the objects of love for their own sake. Obvious and abstract as this generalization is, though, it can explain why the two more striking proposals that we considered and rejected were at least plausible candidates for a characterization of love. Though loving someone need not in general involve a desire actively to benefit her, the disposition to benefit, to comfort, to help the loved one if she needs it, follows directly from the fact that you care about her good. If one's grown children neither want nor need one's help, they are doing perfectly well on their own, thank you very much, a good parent's love may rightly express itself simply in her rejoicing in her children's well-being and accomplishment, and nothing more. Similarly, there may be nothing to do or to want to do in relation to a beloved but faraway friend whose life is full and going well without one's assistance. But if one's loved one is in trouble and one is in a position to help, one will necessarily be moved to relieve her distress. Thus, even if Velleman is right that love as such is not to be identified with a set of aims, the disposition to acquire such aims under appropriate conditions is inseparable from the attitude of deep caring that is fundamental to love. Velleman's own proposal to understand love as an arresting awareness of a person's value seems to me similarly connected to the attitude of deep caring. It is commonly recognized that caring for someone for her own sake means that her good is directly a good for you. Her pleasures, as it were, are your pleasures. Her pains are your pains. But caring involves a condition that the characterization just given doesn't make explicit. Namely, that one embraces the emotional vulnerability that this characterization describes. One can imagine one's pleasure or pain being tied to that of another unwillingly, like an unwanted addiction. One might see one's emotional attachment to another person as a sickness or a curse. Such an attitude would be in tension with caring about the other for her own sake. It would be incompatible with wholehearted love. If one genuinely cares about the other person, in other words, one not only feels pleasure at her well-being, it seems right to one that one should do so. One takes her existence and her flourishing to be good in itself. That is, one values the beloved. One regards her life, or her memory if she's dead, as worth preserving and protecting. We may express this by saying that when one loves someone, one values the beloved as an end in herself. That is, her existence and her good are a part of one's system of ends, which one takes to provide reasons as well as motives for action independently of their effect on one's own happiness. And this has implications. Specifically, even though valuing someone doesn't necessarily involve focusing on her status as valuable, and so it doesn't require that one actually have an arrested awareness of the beloved's value, it does seem to imply that one is prepared to see her as valuable if circumstances call for one to focus on her in that way. This explains how one can genuinely love one's children even as they are whining in the back seat. How it can be true that one loves one's meddlesome aunt even if one anticipates her upcoming visit with less than wholehearted enthusiasm. Even during periods when you don't like the people you love very much, you continue to value them. And though your valuing them may remain in the background for much of the time, when circumstances call for you to focus on your loved ones in a certain way, you stand ready to see and appreciate their value. Loving, then, is fundamentally caring deeply and personally for a person for her own sake. It is this attitude toward the beloved that underlies both the desires to benefit and be with her and the admiring and appreciative images of her that the other philosophers I've mentioned have been tempted to identify with love. Love is, if you will, an orientation in the world that shapes our responses to the shifting circumstances in which we and our loved ones find ourselves. In some situations, it makes us think about people in a certain way. In others, it inspires us to action. Is it this feature of love that makes love so distinctively and exceptionally valuable? I suspect that it is, and I suspect further that the reason it is, put it as succinctly as possible, is that caring deeply and personally for another person or persons for their own sakes roots us motivationally to the world. Let me explain. Part of what I mean in saying that love roots us motivationally to the world is simply that love gives us reasons to live. That is, it gives us reasons to get up in the morning, to go to work, to feed ourselves, to face another day. Often these reasons include the fact that by living we can help the people we love, we can contribute to their welfare, we can raise our children, care for our parents, or just be there for our spouses and friends. In addition, we have reason to want simply to share the world with our loved ones, to spend time with them in joint activity and conversation, and sometimes just to observe as their lives go along on their own tracks. In this respect, love stands in contrast to other kinds of valuing. Thus, as I mentioned before, it seems to me that there are ways in which one may care, even care quite a lot, about others for their own sake, that most of us would not classify as cases of love. While working on the first draft of this lecture, a catastrophic earthquake in Haiti occurred, and thousands of people responded immediately and energetically with offers of help and donations of money, of food, and of physical assistance. As with previous natural as well as some unnatural disasters, it tempered the sorrow and the horror of the tragic events to see the gratifying display of people caring and acting to express their care for their fellow human beings for their own sakes. But such care, though genuine, does not amount to love, at least for most of us. And this is reflected in the fact that, again, for most of us, the chance to help those who desperately need it around the world, to be ready when the next earthquake or tsunami or hurricane hits, does not provide us with a reason to get up in the morning. Our commitments to justice, to honesty, to morality more generally, occupy similar places in our motivational systems. As inhabitants of the earth and members of the human community, most of us are committed to doing our share to respect, if not to improve, the world of which we are a part. But that commitment doesn't give us reasons to be in the world. They only come into play because we are here and motivated to continue to be here anyway. Arguably, the fact that love is different from duty or other kinds of disinterested valuing in this respect may constitute an objection to the Stoic view of the good life I mentioned earlier in this lecture, according to which the best life is a life of virtue. Even if one agrees that a virtuous life is unilaterally better than a less virtuous one, if it doesn't provide you with a reason to live, how good can it be? If the theory is meant to capture the ingredients of a fully successful life, of a life well lived, then something seems missing from it, and love will fill the bill. But is love the only thing that will fill the bill? It would have to be if, as I'm suggesting, the fact that love roots us motivationally to the world is what makes love special. Two objections to this claim spring to mind, however, almost as soon as I express this suggestion. The first is that my presentation of love's motivational power seems to presume that, were it not for loved ones in our lives, the day-to-day business of loving would be for us nothing but a series of arduous chores. It is sad but true that many people are in precisely that situation. They have mind-numbing or back-breaking jobs, they battle daily with physical pain and discomfort, and they have little or no prospect of their circumstances improving. For a significant portion of such people, it may be the love of their friends and family that keeps them going and that makes their lives worthwhile. But many of us, most of us here, I expect, are luckier than that. We have plenty of reasons to get up in the morning that have nothing to do with our loved ones. We don't need a reason to drag ourselves to work because we love our work, or we love the courses we are taking, the books we are reading, the research we are doing. Or we may love other things in our lives. Our daily walks, our cello practice, the tennis matches we play, maybe even the academic conferences we choose to attend. Understood one way, this is an objection I'm happy to accept. It brings out a need to modify my proposal, but in a way that preserves its intended spirit. In particular, if what is meant by the idea that one loves one's work or one's hobby or the woods outside one's house is that these activities or their associated objects are for one ends in themselves, whose existence and flourishing one cares about for their own sakes, then granting this objection doesn't show that love isn't special in rooting us motivationally to the world. Rather, it shows that love need not be restricted to love of other people. We may love philosophy, or music, or the Great Smoky Mountains as well. In these cases, too, when we love, we care deeply and personally about something for its own sake. It's true that ordinarily when we say or approve of the thought that love makes the world go round, it is interpersonal love that we have in mind, and empirically it's likely that this is the most common and the deepest type of love people tend to have. But I see no harm in admitting the possibility of extending the range of love to other possible objects. There's another way of understanding the objection, however, that blends into the second objection that comes to mind. For another thing that we may mean when we say of a person that he loves his work or philosophy or the mountains is that he very much enjoys it, and that because of this, going to work or reading philosophy or hiking is a pleasure, a good, for him. This is related to the second objection to my proposal, namely, why isn't self-love enough to root us motivationally to the world? Having good friends and family is great, one might say, and most of us would be much less happy than we are if we didn't have them, but that doesn't mean that in their absence we would be suicidal. People have strong survival instincts, indeed strong drives not just for their survival, but for success in whatever form they happen to conceive it. Don't these drives provide them with reason enough to get up and face another day? Don't these suffice to root most of us motivationally to the world? Now, one might think that I could respond to this objection in the same way I responded to the first, by suggesting that these challenges only serve to show that the kind of love we are interested in should be extended yet again to include not just love of activities and objects other than people, but to include love of self. To concede this, however, would violate the spirit of the familiar saying to such an extent as to deprive it of its point. To someone who includes self-love in the love that she understands as making the world go round, at least if self-love is understood to be roughly equivalent to a healthy self-interest, it would be appropriate to ask, as opposed to what? To put it another way, the familiar adage that love makes the world go round is most sensibly understood as making a claim about love that is meant to set love's power apart from the pervasive force of self-interest. At any rate, that is the sense of the adage that I've been concerned to defend, and that I still want to defend in the face of the objection. I have said that love, meaning love of others, roots us motivationally to the world in a way that self-interest fails to do. But as the objection we are considering rightly notes, love is not the only thing that motivates people to get up in the morning and that gives them a reason to live. Most people also want to live for their own sakes and for the sake of satisfying their self-interested desires. Responding to this objection gives me an opportunity to explain further what I mean in saying that love of others, that is, roots us motivationally to the world. In making this claim, rather than the simpler and more straightforward claim that love has the power to motivate, period, I mean to indicate something non-trivial about different possible attitudes to the world. Specifically, it seems to me that when one loves someone or something other than oneself, one has a reason to care about the world that is different in kind from the reasons one has if one cares only about oneself. For the world, the real world, I want to say, for emphasis, and to contrast it with a fantasy world, is the place, the only possible place, in which you and your loved one can meet. It is the plane of existence you share with the object of your love, and it is the only place where your loved one can flourish. So if you love someone, you have a stake in the world, in being in and in appropriate touch with the world. You have a reason, therefore, to care not only about the ones you love, but about the world in which they and you both live. Now, a critic might object that you would have reason to care about the world even if you only care about yourself. For you live in the world too. Where else would you live? And you had better pay attention to it if you want to go on living. No matter what reason you have to get out of bed in the morning, that bed is in the world, the real world, as I put it. And if you are not in proper touch with it, you might fall getting out of it and break your neck. You'd better see the real world train that is rushing at you so that you know to jump out of the way. You had better find some real world food with which to nourish yourself, and so on. The interest one must have in the world in these latter examples, however, is purely instrumental. If someone else took care of your safety and sustenance for you, it would be just as well. The point I'm trying to make can be reinforced by reflecting on a thought experiment introduced to the philosophical world by Robert Nozick in 1974. Nozick asked us to imagine an experience machine, a science fictional contraption one can hook oneself up to that would induce in us all the thoughts and feelings that conform to whatever life we think would be the best possible for us. If one wanted to be a movie star, an Olympic athlete, a Nobel Prize winner, the experience machine would give you the experience of being one. If you wanted to climb Mount Everest, bask on the beach, or sip a fine aged Burgundy, the machine would give you the sensations that the best versions of these activities would involve. The point of the imaginative exercise comes in asking oneself whether, if such a machine were available and one had perfect confidence in its not breaking down, one would choose to hook oneself up to it and live happily, albeit delusionally, ever after. Not everyone answers the question the same way. Some people react by saying, "Where do I sign up?" Others are appalled at the idea. To me, the answer all depends, or at least depends most cogently, on love. From a purely egoistic perspective, the experience machine has evident attractions. At least it would assure you more net happiness and less net suffering than you are likely to achieve if you live life the hard way. But if there are loved ones in your life, that is apt to give you a decisive reason not to plug yourself in. For the experience machine would deprive you of your loved ones. You would never be able to see them or talk to them, to comfort or be comforted by them again. You could have simulated experiences of love, but they would involve figments of your or of the machine's imagination. Your actual spouse or parent or child or best friend would be forever lost to you. The reasons love gives you not to plug into the experience machine are reflective of a kind of attachment to the world that one has, and that one has reason to have if one loves someone else, and that I suggest one doesn't have if there is nothing and no one outside of yourself whom you love. This is what I mean when I suggest that love of another gives you a stake in the world and roots you motivationally to it. The point, which is reinforced by contemplation of the experience machine, is that although love and self-interest may both motivate you to get up in the morning and provide you with reasons to live, they give you different reasons, with implications that go well beyond the self-evident ones that self-interest makes you pursue your own good, while love moves you to pursue the good of the beloved. In saying that love gives you a stake in the world, I mean to point out that if you love, you have a reason to be interested in the world, a reason why what happens in the world matters to you. Thus, whereas self-interest gives you reasons that move you to get up in the morning so as to experience the world, love gives you reasons that move you to connect to the world and contribute to it. Perhaps this is part of what people mean to express by the idea that love makes the world go round. Love and not virtue, love and not the pursuit of individual happiness. Moreover, if this is what they mean by the adage, they would be right. Or at any rate, this I believe.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. That's a lovely and moving essay. And my gratitude to Jeffrey and Bennett and Agnieszka and Nicole for organizing this wonderful event, and to the generous funders and sponsors of the whole project. Thank you very much. But in addition to expressing my appreciation, I have to say that I'm not at all looking forward to this conference. The role of a commentator is to say, yes, but. So I have to say, well, yes, love, but. Sure, love is fine, but it's the major cause of homicide and assault. Love is fine, except that the third most terrible thing in the world is wanting love and not having it. And the second most horrible thing in the world is losing love. And the most absolutely worst, most terrible, horrible, no good thing that can possibly happen to you is being betrayed in love. I'm the commentator, so it's my duty to say these things, and then no one will sit next to me at dinner. Or if they have to, they'll turn away and talk to the person on the other side of them. And everybody will remember after, oh, Alan Fiske, I remember him. He's the guy who's against love. So you can see why I'm not really looking forward to this. But I shall do my duty and say, yes, but. Love definitely makes the world go round, and in fact, it can make your head spin. Susan said that beautifully, and I'd be just as happy to leave it at that. But what makes academic conferences go round is controversy, so why don't I try to say something controversial, but loving in a roundabout way. There's no doubt about what Susan says, that love makes life meaningful. But she said that Western philosophers have said very little about that. However, non-Western philosophers and theologians of all sorts have said a great deal about it. The most important strand of Hinduism, Vaishnavism, for about 2,000 years, has extolled the fundamental joy of bhakti, loving devotion to Krishna, leading to ecstatic union with him. Various traditions of Tantra have pursued the divine through sexual love. Jainism prescribes totally selfless generosity and loving care, not to harm any human being. Buddhism revolves around loving compassion, which for many Buddhists is the vehicle and expression of ultimate oneness. Likewise, Sufism is aimed at ecstatic, loving union with divinity. The basic meaning and core ritual of Shia Islam is self-sacrificing love for the martyred Hussein ibn Ali and his family, which involves, for young men, often self-flagellation of the most severe kind. The central tenet of Confucianism is the duty of filial piety, which you may or may not want to equate with love, but it's complemented by the responsibility of parents and rulers to care for their dependents. And then there's this other religion from the Levant that you may have encountered that's supposed to be all about love. I've heard tell. What else did Jesus talk about, after all? And by the way, it's intriguing in relation to your comment that mostly when people talk about love, they mean love for other human beings, that for a great many people in the world for thousands of years, the most important and most meaningful love is the love for immaterial beings and the love of those immaterial beings for them. Why is that? That's something I've been trying to figure out for 40 or 50 years now. But in any case, in most of these religions, the deity's love entails loving relations among humans as well, and there are millions of pages of religious text on this, theological and more philosophical. So there has been a great deal written on love, but not in the tradition of, as you say, of Western philosophy. And it's, as I say, it's really intriguing that a great deal of what's been written about love and what's been meaningful to people about love has been not love between living Homo sapiens, but between human beings and immaterial entities. And one might well ask, why is it that for some people this love of immaterial beings, the to and from immaterial beings, is more real and more valid and more meaningful than love between actual human beings? I also want to say that in many cultures, love among human beings is the culturally explicated core of the meaningful life, although typically in many cultures it's not either romantic love nor informal loving friendships. So various institutionalized forms of love have been crucial in different cultures. Among the Greeks, the most sacred relationship was the love and loyalty of Xenia, the host-guest relationship, whose patron was Zeus himself. When Paris violated his Xenia relationship with Menelaus, the Trojan War began, resulting in many deaths and one great poem. The Xenia relationship remained important around the Mediterranean until quite recently in many cultures there. In Catholic populations, especially in Southern Europe and Latin America, a person who is godparent of your child is your own compadre or comadre, and in many of these cultures, the compadrazgo relationship is the most trusting, compassionate, and supporting of all relationships. So it would not be a misnomer to call it a form of love. In Africa, ancient Scythia and elsewhere, mixing one's blood with another, cutting your hand, for example, or your leg, mixing the blood and then jointly ingesting it together, created a ritual bond, usually between two men, and they could ask each other for anything and would protect each other with their lives. In some forms of this, what's miscalled blood brotherhood, men granted each other access to their wives or gave their daughters to each other in marriage, although they never did both of those things, either one or the other. Among East African pastoralists, men initiated in the same span of years become age mates, who as young men eat together, raided cattle together, shared their responsibilities, assumed joint liabilities for each other's actions, and defended each other to the death. Again, if their wives agreed, they could have sex with each other's wives, although never ever with each other's daughters. Perhaps the most amazing selfless love is the love of soldiers for their fellow soldiers in a small unit. They don't have to like each other, but their love motivates them to have each other's back, to never let each other down, and ultimately, if necessary, to die to protect their comrades. So, in short, in a great many cultures and contexts, it's definitely true that love makes the world go round. Love provides a core meaning, a fundamental commitment, and sometimes the most absolute purpose for human life, but it's not necessarily in the kinds of relationships that we're most familiar with in our culture today. In any case, as Susan says, love certainly gives you a reason for getting out of bed in the morning, except when it gives you a reason to stay in bed together. But is that the reason, or even a good reason, for valuing love? As Susan wrote in her 2010 book on meaning in life, committed involvement in just about anything makes life meaningful. People get out of bed with alacrity early in the morning to kill infidels, to torture suspects, or hack into computers to steal credit card numbers and crash computers. So I don't think we really want to say that something is valuable just because it gets you out of bed in the morning, eagerly looking forward to your day. Some kinds of meaning are meaningful, but crass or evil. If you're eager to purify your notion by eliminating Tutsi or eliminating Vietnamese or eliminating Jews, you're going to be very involved with the world and rarely sleep in. That gives you plenty to do. Vengeance, the desire to maim or kill a blasphemer, or the rage to hurt the lover who betrayed you, all of these connect you quite personally to others so that you deeply care about their personal welfare, which you want to destroy. You may sincerely feel that the world will be better without the people you want to kill. That certainly roots you motivationally in the world, gives a person a stake in the world, and motivates very strong interest in it. So I don't think we should rest the case for love on just the grounds that it makes life meaningful. No doubt the Khmer Rouge experienced their lives as very meaningful, as did the inquisitors in the Inquisition. This brings me to another question which is hard to resolve. Loving deeply and passionately is probably the most wonderful experience in human life, but deep and passionate love can also lead to one of the most miserable experiences in human life, when you or your partner betrays that love, or when you somehow start disappointing and offend each other and it all goes to hell. What generated the most joyous meaning can engender the most grievous misery when it breaks down. I, for one, won't walk away from love out of fear of that eventuality, but it's something we have to acknowledge when we think about love, at least analytically. And it's not just love. All sorts of meaning are precarious. Many deeply important projects and activities turn out badly, leading to ennui, disenchantment, despair, disgust, or rage. Perhaps part of what makes commitment to meaningful engagement meaningful is engaged commitment, that is, choosing to face these risks and sometimes even facing certain failure or death in the pursuit of something worth doing, despite or whatever its eventual outcome. There's one more thing I want to consider about modes of meaningfulness. For many people in many cultures, including many in our own culture, rule following and role conformity make life meaningful. For many people, the good life is correct performance of practices, routines, and rituals that conform to identity-defining tradition. Indeed, as an anthropologist, I would venture to speculate that most people in the world define the good life as adherence to tradition. Moreover, for most people in the world for thousands of years, the good and proper life is the life that pleases the gods. Propitiating ancestors, spirits, and deities is the most important concern in life. Indeed, life should consist of adherence to the will of ancestors, spirits, and deities. There's no other meaning of any important consequence for most people in the history of the world. And then at the other side, there are other folks, like many Buddhists, who are committed to the idea that commitment to things is a fruitless illusion. The ultimate meaning in life is to escape and transcend worldly meanings, including loving relationships with other humans. And then again, there are folks like the African villagers with whom I lived, whose main long-term goal in life is to bear and rear children who survive to bear and rear their own children. Thus, one leaves descendants who maintain the lineage. Moreover, one's descendants make offerings to their parents and grandparents who died, so that having children and grandchildren is what makes an otherwise merely dead person an honored ancestor. This leads to a fact that is fundamental, not to say perturbing. Susan perceptively pointed out that philosophers, even more than most people, and I'm quoting, may have a tendency to project too much of their own needs and desires onto the rest of humanity, noting, and I quote, "We should be cautious and circumspect in assessing and supporting claims to the universality of philosophers' own, perhaps peculiar needs and desires. I might add that we should be cautious about generalizing even when most academics or most educated Westerners share many of the philosophers' needs and concerns. There's ample evidence that modern educated Westerners are psychologically and socially very different from most Homo sapiens. The most crucial difference here is that the perception of the preoccupation of billions of people's lives is life, just staying alive. The goal of many people is to find food, avoid violence, recover from illness and injury. Their desire and their need is to live. If you're just trying to survive, other meanings may recede into irrelevance. So we need to put the question of the meaningful life into perspective, remembering that many people get out of bed because they're hungry or in danger, or can't get out of bed because they're ill or injured. Famine and plague often reduce life to a nasty, brutish struggle for survival. So some sorts of meaning, if this is rude, I'm sorry, but some sorts of meaning are primarily effete concerns of the elite in times of peace and prosperity. Yet, an amazing aspect of human nature is that when lives are at stake, mothers, fellow soldiers, neighbors, and strangers quite often risk their lives or willingly sacrifice themselves to save others. Susan mentioned the earthquake in Haiti, and the evidence is actually that in cases like the earthquake in Haiti, but in other cases of sudden and collective disaster, earthquake, devastating eruptions, landslides or explosions, fire, flood, hurricane, or tornado, something amazing happens. Most people become wonderfully altruistic, kind, compassionate, generous, and even heroic. I highly recommend to you Rebecca Solnitz's book, Paradise Built in Hell, which describes this kind of anarchist dream of universal love in the face of disaster. An astonishing discovery is that many victims of, and I put victims in quote, of mass disaster, many survivors, find the ensuing hours and days and even weeks to be the most profoundly, joyously meaningful times of their entire lives. For a few, disaster reorients their entire lives toward the pursuit of the most meaningful, compassionate involvement. So in sudden collective disasters, many people find that they love everyone and devote themselves to caring for each other, including for complete strangers or people of ethnicities or social classes that they would otherwise despise and avoid. And then they usually find that nothing is ever quite so meaningful again. But I'm a psychological anthropologist, so perhaps rather than offering you bad philosophy, I should present some good anthropology. What do we know empirically about love? Well, obviously I don't have time to review the literature on love, but there is a large empirical literature, and there's something that you may or may not want to call love, but which I think love is the prototype of. And the essence of that is the sense that the self and the other are one, that they're equivalent, that we are equivalent in some essential respect. This doesn't mean a failure to distinguish between the self and the loved ones in other respects. It means that we have something in common that matters, something essential both literally and figuratively. So your joys are my joys, your suffering is my suffering, what's mine is yours, and we're a unit together taking joint responsibility for many things. We know that is something that is true across these many forms of love that you've talked about and that I've talked about today, that they have this undermining sense of oneness or unity or equivalence. So that, I think, we can fairly say is an empirical fact. We know physiologically a good deal about love. Everybody here probably knows that oxytocin and vasopressin, along with prolactin and dopamine and testosterone, are chemical mediators of love. The locations of receptors to these hormones are crucial to your capacity for love. So whether you love or don't love depends on, turns out, sometimes as little as one gene that determines the locus of your receptors to oxytocin. We know that you can take MDMA, you can take ecstasy, and then for a while you love absolutely everybody around you. Because, in fact, it produces a cascade of oxytocin. We know something very interesting, and that is if you are touched in this way, and between about this fast and this fast, between about 3 and 30 centimeters, there's a particular kind of unmyelinated cutaneous afferent that projects up to the insula, okay, that is tuned to respond to nothing but caressing. There's a particular kind of neuron. Probably in mammalian evolution, it originally responded to licking, which is what mammal mothers and friendly mammals do to each other. But in humans, it responds to caressing. And so forth and so on. We know many things that many kinds of behaviors that enhance and sustain love. And we know something about the evolutionary value of love, most of which is too obvious to go into. But I want to say that we also know that there are other kinds of relationships beyond love or communal sharing or whatever you want to call this thing that Susan was focusing on. There are at least 3 other kinds of relationships that humans find intrinsically meaningful, intrinsically rewarding, and morally imbued. So if love is one of the things that makes the world go round, it turns out that there are 3 other mechanisms that also help the world go round. And each of them is both biologically based and yet culturally informed and can only actually be realized in culture-specific forms. So I want to say that the meaningful human life, meaningful social life, is not reducible to love. Love is one fundamental way of engaging in the world and probably the most important, but there are 3 others that are also essential. First, it's rewarding and meaningful and engaging to balance and reciprocate in kind. Obviously, people are very engaged in sports and games, whose essential framework consists of opportunities, plays, pieces, and teams that are evenly matched one-to-one. But people also find it intrinsically meaningful to buy a cup of coffee for someone and then have them buy coffee next time, or to exchange dinner invitations, or birthday presents, or to take turns in all other kinds of contexts. To make things even that can't be evenly divided, people commit to fair lotteries, and we commit ourselves to the results of fair elections based on one person, one vote. This system of social coordination is called equality matching. It's ubiquitous around the world because the world can't get along without it. And for our psychosocial well-being, we need it. It's good. Second, we need legitimate, responsible hierarchy, or what I call authority ranking. Although many academics and others in the West and in the US in particular find authority ranking problematic, most people in the world regard legitimate hierarchy as natural, necessary, and right. They want it. We do too, even when we don't quite acknowledge it. I, for one, absolutely depend on my department chair, my dean, my provost, the chancellor, and the president to run the university and mediate with outsiders so that I can happily engage with my research and teaching. And I am willing and happy, in a Hobbesian sort of way, to say, oh, you may have the power to do this as long as I get to do my work and live in a comfortable academic environment. But in my teaching and research, I also myself direct and supervise and instruct people who look up to me for guidance. Moreover, as I said early on, religious people, many religious people, feel that they need a supreme deity who guides and protects and rewards and punishes. But in human life, all our institutions, from parenthood to government, from the fire department to the army, require leadership and loyal subordinates following them. Most people want superiors they can look up to and who will look out for them. These authority-ranking relationships are more or less essential to making our world go round. Although it's interesting that hunter-gatherer societies, especially when the prototypical hunter-gatherer societies that don't store food and can't transport it, seem to get along with little or no authority ranking and often are quite hostile to it. Along with communal sharing, equality matching, and authority ranking, we need one more system to make the world run like clockwork. Just as my grandfather clock organizes my time into seconds and minutes, hours and days, weeks and months, we need systems of proportionality to organize our social relations. We need proportionality in wages and rents and interests and taxes and tithes and prices, but we also want rewards and punishment to be proportional. Would life be meaningful if you might arbitrarily be sentenced to 40 years in prison for an expired parking meter, while a mass murderer was fined $25? Moreover, utilitarian moral systems are based on the Archimedean principle that every good and bad outcome can be weighed on the same scale of utility. Every moral aspect of life is fungible in proportion to every other. We can't make the world go round without proportionality. It's fundamentally meaningful, and it's the most sophisticated way to engage in the world because it's the only way to systematically connect everything to everything else. Ask any economist. Proportionality certainly makes most of us get up in the morning to get to work on time or simply to be more productive working at home. So, humans need love, authority ranking, equality matching, and proportionality. They need all four to engage with each other in meaningful lives. We know this from hundreds of studies. And one thing we've discovered is that when any of these types of relationships go systematically wrong, when they malfunction, people are unhappy and sometimes miserable, sometimes to the point of being psychologically disabled. People need to relate in these ways in the culturally appropriate manners and the culturally appropriate circumstances. In short, these four types of social relationships make the world go round, not only because they connect the person to something beyond herself, but because they are the means for social coordination and especially cooperation. They are the ways we do things together, jointly, transcending our limits as individuals. It's how we make our families, teams, institutions, communities, societies, and the whole world community function. They're how we make the world go round. This I believe, sort of, or I would if I believed in belief